I'm Amber Wang, and welcome to Marginalia, where we discuss the impacts of literature and how it can shape our lives. In this episode, we're going to be talking about The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, originally published in 1850. So before we start talking about the book, I want to give you a little background information on our author, Nathaniel Hawthorne, that'll help us understand the book better. So Hawthorne was born in 1804 in Salem, Massachusetts, and he is a fifth-generation Puritan descendant. Hawthorne's great-great-grandfather, William Hawthorne, was a judge who immigrated from England to Salem in 1630, and his grandfather, Colonel John Hawthorne, was a judge during the Salem witch trials. And Hawthorne felt a sense of guilt for his family's actions as a persecutor of Quakers and witches, and so he wanted to disassociate himself from his ancestors. Thus, Nathaniel Hawthorne added a W to his name to make the spelling match the pronunciation and to separate from his Puritan roots. So from this, we note that he deeply criticizes Puritans and he does not hold them in a bright place in his heart. Similarly, The Scarlet Letter is an embodiment of moral traits, and some of the biggest themes being hypocrisy and sin. It also essentially displays Hawthorne's lifelong preoccupation with secrecy and guilt and the lingering effects of Puritanism on him. Additionally, set during this time period was dark romanticism, which is a genre steeped in complex emotions and expressions of individualism. It emphasizes human fallibility and sin. According to dark romantics, even good men and women drift towards sin and self-destruction, and there can be unintended consequences that arise from well-intended social reforms. This genre was thought to have emerged from the Transcendental movement in 19th century America. However, whereas Transcendentalists felt perfection and their own divinity as innate qualities of mankind, dark romantics believed the opposite, that humans gravitate to evil and self-destruction. Furthermore, dark romanticism is a subgenre of romanticism that depicts nature as a mysterious and foreboding place, whereas romanticism views nature as beautiful and divine. Romantics often portray nature as sinister and use it to highlight the darker aspect of human nature, which we will see illustrated in The Scarlet Letter. Now, onto our book. So this book is set in Boston, Massachusetts in the 1650s when the first generation of Puritans came to America from England. So note that the time period in which the book was set was about 200 years before the book was published. And before the story begins, the book opens with an introductory material, The Custom House, which takes up the first 30 pages of the book. It is based on Hawthorne's experiences working at the Salem Custom House, which is a customs office, and this short account tells of the fictionalized story of an anonymous narrator who discovers documents containing a worn scarlet letter. The novel, according to this narrator, is his fictionalized story behind the Scarlet Letter. And now we'll learn more about the actual story. Now, the actual plot behind the Scarlet Letter involves main characters Hester Prynne, who committed adultery, Roger Chillingworth, Hester's long-lost husband who failed to land in Boston with her due to being captured by Indians, Pearl, Hester's daughter, and Arthur Dimmesdale, a renowned preacher. The story follows the four through love, revenge, secrecy, and hypocrisy, all formed by a deed of sin. Let us dive deep into our analysis and unpacking of this novel as it contains so much analysis and goodness that we can use. So if you have not read the novel, I advise you to stop here and then revisit after you've read the novel. And before I start, I want to say that since there are so much analysis in this book, I will be going briefly over the plot in chronological order as the story progresses, so I will be missing some details from certain chapters, but the overall theme will be around Hester Prynne, our main character. So let's start off with the sign of hypocrisy within the novel. The first one being early in chapter 1, where the Puritans are surrounding the prison in which Hester Prynne walks out from and talks about building a utopia. Their version is imperfect because in their desired perfect world, there would still exist prisons and cemeteries, all settings that are described in the book. But in a real perfect utopia, these places wouldn't exist because there would not be any crimes. And therefore, the Puritans are greedy and ignore reality in which they try and build the perfect world that is seemingly impossible. And as Hester Prynne steps out from the prison and into the public, instead of being ashamed of committing adultery and facing ignominy, public shame, Hester appears full of confidence and defiance, which is one of her most notable character traits as seen by her scarlet letter that she wears on her chest. And despite being placed on the scaffold, which is a symbol of ignominy, Hester is full of resistance and appears independent, even though she is carrying Pearl, her daughter. And she does not let the Puritan judgment of others get to her and wears her scarlet letter A, standing for adultery, proudly. In the beginning to middle of the novel, the reader can start to infer about the relationship between Hester and Dimmesdale, who is the renowned preacher, because he would often defend her in public and is really understanding towards her and her situation. And it is actually revealed later that Dimmesdale is the father of Hester's baby Pearl and the person Hester committed adultery with. Simultaneously, as the story progresses, we also meet Roger Chillingworth, Hester's husband that she had before she came to Boston, and it is known that they had not seen each other for several years due to their separation. Now, getting back on track, after Hester receives her punishment, which is publicly standing on the scaffold for shame and embarrassment, Hester decides to remain in Boston because that is the place where she sinned, and she feels a connection to it that she must live it out there as her own punishment for herself. And she also feels a connection with someone there, which we figure to be Dimmesdale. And another symbol of hypocrisy within this is that the townspeople adore Hester for her sewing and her pieces of clothing, which is like a hobby that Hester finds herself to do because even though she still lives in Boston, she is ostracized and outcasted by the rest of her community. And as Hester is praised for her work, in which the governor even wants to wear, they still whisper behind her backs and condemn her for her sins. And while wearing Hester's clothing, the Puritans ignore Hester's sinful origins of committing adultery. And even through all of this, Hester still wears her scarlet letter because she believes that it gives her the power to empathize with others and allows her to detect others' sins. On this topic, we should also note that Pearl becomes obsessed with the letter because symbolically, Pearl represents the sin that the Scarlet Letter represents, as she is a product of adultery between Hester and Dimmesdale. And that is why her attraction to the Scarlet Letter is so pivotal to the novel's hypocrisy, because Pearl does not realize the truth and the relationship between Hester and Dimmesdale at this point. And while all of this is happening, Chillingworth decides to get revenge on the person that committed adultery with Hester, which he eventually suspects to be Dimmesdale. So Chillingworth starts to get closer with Dimmesdale using his doctoral background and pretends to tend to Dimmesdale's health issues, but actually worsening it. Therefore, Dimmesdale's conditions worsen not only due to Chillingworth and his effect, but also because of the consequences of keeping his sin a secret and not confessing, and it's starting to rip him apart and deprives him of life. And Chillingworth becomes more obsessive and intrusive to Dimmesdale's secret because Chillingworth does not know that Dimmesdale is the father of Pearl because Dimmesdale has never said anything. And that makes Dimmesdale more vulnerable since he can't see that Chillingworth is an enemy, and he still keeps Chillingworth close by him as an actual doctor. And it's easy to think, why wouldn't Dimmesdale just confess? Like, it would release him of his stress, of his anxiety, and of his sufferings. But Dimmesdale does not realize that because he thinks that if he confesses, it'll contradict his prestigious position as a preacher, and he fears of being a hypocrite because of his real deeds versus his preaches. And note that Dimmesdale actually has a lot of chances to confide in one of his peers, one of the Puritans, about his sufferings, such as Hester, such as Governor Bellingham, and such as Mistress Hibbins, even though they all have different backgrounds. But Dimmesdale fails to recognize that he can trust others, and thus he contains his suffering to himself. Furthermore, Dimmesdale goes through penance, meaning he harms himself, such as by starving and whipping himself, in hopes of justifying his sins without needing to publicly confess. And out of suffering, Dimmesdale actually approaches the scaffold at night and publicly confesses with Hester and Pearl by his side. This is the second scaffold scene apart from the first that we saw in the first chapter, and highlights the shift from that first chapter where he was in denial. However, this does not serve Dimmesdale's ultimate confession because this one is still in secrecy at night and does not help relieve Dimmesdale of his suffering. And as the story progresses, it's been 7 years since the first scene at the first scaffold out of the prison, and the Puritans no longer view Hester as an outcast, but a strong, compassionate individual who they've come to accept. However, Hester does not feel that way herself. Instead, she feels weaker and more isolated because of all that she's been through. Although she still resides in Boston, she resides on the outskirts by herself and Pearl. And turning our attention back to the topic of hypocrisy, as Pearl is now older, she often asks Hester the meaning of the Scarlet Letter, but Hester lies and does not tell Pearl the truth, which goes against how she urged Chillingworth to expose his truth of his attentions to Dimmesdale. And after all that has happened, Hester and Dimmesdale had little contact with each other until the near end of the novel, when Hester and Dimmesdale meet up in a forest where they are concealed from society. There, they discuss their plans for the future and decides to run away with Pearl, escaping their sins and not confronting it. The forest in this scene serves as a symbol of secrecy and hell, which is a characteristic of dark romanticism that we talked about that contradicts romanticism. And instead of confronting their sins and facing their guilt and putting an end and closure into their story, they don't do that, but instead decides to forever run away from it. And at this point, I realized that their plan would not work because they don't have an official conclusion to their sins, and this situation does not have closure by them simply running away. And therefore, when Hester finds out that Chillingworth will be attending the same ship with them, I knew that the story wouldn't be over just yet. Chillingworth does so because he still hasn't achieved his revenge. However, much to his dislike, in the end, after delivering his last sermon, Dimmesdale approaches the scaffold, and this is the third scene, and confesses his sins to the public. First of all, I want to highlight the symbolic nature of the scenes with the scaffold. The first scaffold scene is Dimmesdale in denial. The second scene is Dimmesdale secretly confessing in the night where no one sees. And the third scene right now is when he actually publicly confesses. And it just shows how much Dimmesdale has evolved, and after all the penance that he has inflicted on himself and all that he's been through, he's finally ready to confess and face whatever comes next for him. And he expects to face ignominy and dislike from the public, but he actually does not receive any of that like he thought he would, because he dies after confessing, and while dying, he holds his chest and reveals that he has a scarlet letter carved onto his chest. And the public would mourn over his accomplishments instead of criticizing him, because that's the result of a diseased person. So even though Dimmesdale dies after his confession, the public would not hold him accountable for his sins, because that would be unmoral. And even the Puritans wouldn't be able to do that. Now, Dimmesdale's death has sparked several reactions out of our main characters. For example, Chillingworth is absolutely enraged because his desire for revenge made him inhumane, and he has lost his purpose as Dimmesdale confessed, which means that Chillingworth will be no longer able to torture Dimmesdale, and that he basically has no purpose left to live. On the other hand, Pearl has gotten what she wanted, which is to be publicly accepted by Dimmesdale, and this marked her as a human and no longer a sin that was ostracized. Hester mourns in remorse for her loss and is unable to do anything except to weep and to recall what she had planned with her lover before his death. In the final chapter, we see that after Dimmesdale's death and that time has passed, Pearl lives a happy life in Europe while Hester stays in isolation and eventually passes, and Chillingworth, having lost everything, dies shortly after Dimmesdale. And before we discuss more of the notable relationships within this story, I think that this story has the ending that I had hoped. I really like the ending. I think it offers a closure that we had all hoped for, in which Pearl becomes a woman and she is accepted into society, and Hester slowly fades away, and even though she has a sad ending, but it resonates with her in that she has faced it her whole entire life, and that she was actually buried next to Dimmesdale, and that meant that they could reunite in the afterlife. However, Chillingworth, on the other hand, I think his ending was also expected, and even though he did not get his revenge, he gave his will to Pearl, which is ironic because she is not his daughter and they hadn't had many interactions. But I think he realized his wrongdoings, and that's his way of trying to fix it at the end. And before we officially close off today's episode, I want to highlight the relationships between Pearl and Dimmesdale and Chillingworth and Dimmesdale. So first, Pearl and Dimmesdale. Initially, Pearl feels an intuitive attraction to Dimmesdale and loves to be around him. However, as the novel progresses, Pearl becomes questioning about his relationship with Hester due to the way he always covers his chest as if in pain, which she thinks relates to Hester's scarlet letter on her chest. She understands that Dimmesdale won't publicly confess his relationship with them and sees it as hypocritical because at the night scaffold scene, he does confess, and in the forest, he does confess as well. Ultimately, though, when Dimmesdale does publicly confess his sin in front of everyone and his relationships with Hester and Pearl, Pearl accepts him as her father and concludes their official familial relationship. And additionally, Dimmesdale says that although he has had so much penance, he does not hold any penitence for his actions because of Pearl, who he loves and does not regret at all. Next is the dynamic between Chillingworth and Dimmesdale. The two have a leech effect on each other. Chillingworth is the cause of Dimmesdale's suffering and sucks the life out of Dimmesdale. However, Dimmesdale exploits and kills its host, the leech, aka Chillingworth. Because Chillingworth is all for revenge, he is left with nothing when Dimmesdale confesses his sin, which undoes everything that Chillingworth has ever worked for. Therefore, when Dimmesdale dies, it's no surprise that Chillingworth is stripped of purpose, and his death follows a year after. The two of them are also foils of each other, whereas Dimmesdale could symbolize religion and Chillingworth science. The two occupations contradict each other, as Darwin would later prove, and their roles in the leech effects also contributes to that. Ultimately, this book is really deep and offers a lot of insightful analysis. I highly recommend it, even though it is not an easy read due to its complexity, but I would advise readers to pay close attention to every chapter, since they all contribute pivotal points to the overall themes. Hawthorne's writing is also quite humorous, which I was surprised to find. If you like this book, I recommend checking out Young Goodman Brown, a short story also by Hawthorne that explores similar topics of hypocrisy and sin within dark romanticism. Overall, I give The Scarlet Letter 8.5 stars. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode, and until next time, happy reading.